Glad to see you all. I'm Terry McCarthy, and I'm the President of the Academy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the Marcus Bierich Lecture in the Humanities. Marcus Bierich is former CEO of Robert Bosch GmbH, and then he was chairman of the company's advisory board until he passed in 2000. But we are delighted that his daughter, Nora Bierich, and his granddaughter, Julie Bierich, are here with us tonight. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them and the many others who made this program possible. Vielen Dank. Also, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Dieter Grimm, Senior Fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, who's in the audience this evening and who told me that he's a personal friend of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and also Justice Scalia, which is nice people to have on one's friendship list, although Justice Scalia has passed away. But so nice that you could come tonight. And now please allow me to introduce our speaker, Linda Gordon. So Linda is the Florence Kelly Professor of History and University Professor of the Humanities at New York University, otherwise known as NYU. She's accompanied by her husband, Alan Hunter, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the same university, so you're both very welcome to Berlin. Linda is a two-time winner of the prestigious Bancroft Prize for Best Book in U.S. History, and is best known for her work on the topics of women and gender, right-wing populism, and Mexican Americans. Linda is the author of what many scholars have called the definitive history of birth control politics, first published in 1976 as Woman's Body, Woman's Right, and republished in 2002 as The Moral Property of Woman. In 2017, she published her monograph, The Second Coming of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s and the American political tradition, which serves as the inspiration for her talk tonight. But before she comes up, allow me just to also introduce the moderator for the Q&A after her talk will be Troy McMullen, who's an old friend of mine. He's now executive editor at ABC News and an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and he will be doing the Q&A with her after her talk. But for now, please welcome Linda Gordon to the stage.
Thanks, everyone. It's so pleased that you came, and particularly pleased that I had this opportunity to be with the American Academy, which is a lot owing to the Bierich family, I understand, but also to the fabulous staff that is here, and especially to Caitlin Hahn. We must have exchanged 500 emails arranging this, and she really puts herself out. I want to say a few things by way of introduction. I actually slid into studying the Klan through a larger project on social movements. And in that project, I discovered that the Klan was by far the largest single social movement in the US in the 1920s. Once I discovered that, I thought, a good idea to include this, because I don't want people to think that all social movements are wonderful. But this was a new venture for me in several ways. First of all my previous work was deeply archival. That's sort of what I know how to do. But studying the Klan this way could only produce a case study, because the records, the sources about the Ku Klux Klan are scattered and they are scarce. And secondly, it's new because I had never written about the right wing before. It was, to be honest, current events in the United States that led me then to expanding what was a chapter into a book, and it is a book that tries to look at the Klan at a national level, and therefore it rests a lot on other people's scholarship. And I also just want to mention some very fundamental themes that I am not going to be able to get to in this talk, because I don't want to try your patience too long. One is what it means to be white. Another is the role of eugenics. Another is how the Klan recruited members and what satisfactions they got from being members of the Klan. Now, when I was a young, new left feminist activist, there were some activists who considered themselves, quote, revolutionary, and they liked to spell America with a K. And sometimes they turned the K into a swastika. Some people here may be old enough to remember that. I scoffed at these. I thought that were less because I thought they were offensive than because I thought it was naive. The notion that the U.S. was fascist seemed to me a completely unrealistic and unempirical view of the United States. It's now half a century later, and the label fascist is once again busy in the United States. I understand the anxiety that is leading scholars and journalists to reconsider what fascism means, especially because some of the developments we're thinking about are global. But still, I think the label is more often an expression of condemnation rather than an analytic or even a carefully descriptive category. Now, the first Ku Klux Klan that I assume many people have heard about arose in the southern states immediately after the Civil War. It had one clear, simple goal, and that was to defend white supremacy. It was a terrorist group in the literal meaning of terrorist, meaning that when they lynched, and I'm talking about somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500 people who were lynched, they were not just going after an individual that offended them. Their purpose was to intimidate the whole African American population. By contrast, the Klan that I am discussing is an entirely different beast. It differed from its parent in 6 ways. First of all, it was not the least bit secret. Secondly, it was a mass movement with somewhere between 4 and 6 million members. It included women. It was strongest north of the Mason-Dixon line, and it pursued a winning electoral strategy. The Klan elected 16 senators, several dozen congressmen, 11 state governors, and who knows how many state, county, and municipal officials. And these are people who ran for office as public supporters of the Klan. But the most important difference is that while this second Klan, as it's sometimes called, while it never abandoned its commitment to racism against people of color, it focused its attack on Catholics and Jews. And those groups were the people who dominated the really mass immigration into the United States that began at around 1880. In other words, very few of those immigrants were Protestants. This was a brilliant strategic move. First of all, it aligned itself with earlier nativist movements, which were eminently respectable, led by upper class, often scholars. It was also important because it helped the movement both gain from but also add to an evangelical Protestant Christian revival. It's worth noting, I think, that the Klan had its greatest strength in regions with few immigrants and few people who were not white Protestants. In Oregon, for example, which I wrote about it in the book because it's my home state, Jews constituted 0.1% of the population, and Catholics only a few more, and I bet many Oregonians had never met a Jew. I'm trying to use this Klan to help me think about what fascism might mean in the American context, although what's at stake is obviously global. And since much of our understanding of fascism comes from Europe, I'm going to risk some comparisons with Nazism, even though it is not my area of expertise. Today, however, you can't discuss fascism without discussing, quote, populism. Now, a widely used label. I want to look at the historical substance of these two concepts, and resist the loose and imprecise use of these labels. As widely used today, populism is almost always pejorative. It connotes, if it does not be specific, it connotes demagoguery, it connotes bigotry, it connotes often a rejection of the rule of law and the classical liberal guarantees of due process and civil liberties. But that label, I think, obscures more than it illuminates, and I want to put some specificity in it. Some commentators have tried to do that by distinguishing between left and right populism. But I would argue that, at least these days, there is no such thing as left populism in this pejorative sense. When pundits want to say that Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left are both populists, this is an absurdity in relation to Bernie Sanders, who really would be called here a social democrat. And worse, I think that this alleged equivalence in, quote, extremism works to erode and weaken political literacy, at least in the United States. But I want to start with just a tiny dip back into an earlier history, because it says something about why the label populist is not very, I don't like it very much. And that's the American Populist Party of the 1890s. That political movement expressed the economic grievances of small grain and cotton farmers, coal miners, railroad workers, industrial workers, and small businessmen against big finance and big business. They were angry at corporate power, particularly the railroads, because freight rates were favoring corporate growers and made it very difficult for smallholders to compete. The Populist platform laid out specific proposals designed to benefit these people. It called for progressive income tax. It called for the abolition of national banks. It called for the direct election of senators, which was not the case in those days. It called for an 8-hour working day, government regulation of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone services. Furthermore, it produced some notable women leaders whose ideas could be quite feminist. It had some members who you might call racist, but in the main, racism was very peripheral to what the Populist Party was doing. And so I wish I could do away with the term populism, but I can't. So let me just say, for the sake of brevity, that I have to use it in its currently popular and pejorative manner. We need to treat it, I think, as a cluster concept, which means a concept that encompasses variants that share some, but not necessarily all, of the attributes. In an attempt to do that, I compiled a list of characteristics that seem to me to put substance into what is meant by populism today. I'm sure other people would have a slightly different list, but I hope it can provide some basis for clarity about what I'm talking about. And I think you all had copies of it, and I'm not going to go through listing it, and you can refer to it if you want or not if you don't want. Now, only the first 4 of these features could be found in the 1890 Populist Party or the 2016 Sanders campaign: widespread support, encouragement of activism, speaking for, quote, the people, and charging that the people were being victimized. They did not employ demagoguery, were not authoritarian, and did not speak of, quote, a national destiny. And sometimes their allegations of conspiracies turned out to be true. By contrast, all these features characterize the 1920s Ku Klux Klan and today's populisms. The Klan liked to say that it spoke for the people, but it never supported a single policy that could advantage middle class, working class, or poor people, or in any way limit the power of the 1%. It used what I think to myself as a deformed class analysis, in which the enemies were what they called elites. These were typically defined as secular liberals or urban quote, cosmopolitans, and I want you to bear in mind that at least in the United States, cosmopolitan is a code word for Jewish. It never attacked those with great economic power. Now, in some parlance of both scholars and journalists, fascism might seem to designate merely a more extreme form of populism. Although fascist movements display most of the attributes that I identify as populist, they wore various costumes different enough that I think there can be no generic, universal, or complete definition of fascism. It, too, has to be treated as a cluster concept. Quoting Umberto Eco, who had direct experience with fascism, as some of you know, he wrote, "Fascism has no quintessence. It is a fuzzy totalitarianism, a collage, a beehive of contradictions. The fascist game can be played in many forms." As a result of this lack of clarity, there are some scholars that, including some friends of mine, who feel that the word fascist is just useless and that we should discard it. I find it useful, if only because it points to the fact that conservatisms come in many forms and contents, and they are not all alike. So in what follows, I want to compare fascism and populism as social movements and the values they espouse, not as government regimes. In a word, the adjective fascistic seems to me more useful than the noun fascism, because the adjective can help us to identify tendencies, to recognize the fluidity of social movements with often unpredictable trajectories. Okay, the original Ku Klux Klan shared with Nazi fascism a reliance on violence, but with a major difference. The Nazis sought to eliminate whole populations of vilified groups. The Klan, by contrast, sought to retain these groups in order to maintain the cheap labor supply that they needed, and by raising the cost of resistance to these people. The 1920s Klan, however, sought to exclude those who were not, quote, true Americans from citizenship, and they relied on propaganda and electoral politics to achieve that end. I think that this difference about violence is enormous. I really do not want to minimize it, and I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that fascism is just an extreme form of populism. Although the Klan did often attack legal procedural guarantees, for example, they would have tirades about how criminals were being let go because of these unnecessary rights. But it actually remained committed to its version of democracy. This would be a democracy of these true Americans, the Herrenvolk democracy, as it was called in South Africa, which was an illiberal democracy that would allow majorities of the enfranchised to overrule any minority rights. Okay, now I'm going to start. I often talk about the Klan and like to show pictures. They're not entirely illustrative of what I'm going to say, but they're fun. Both Nazis and Klan people used bigotry not only to attack their enemies, but also to build the loyalty of their chosen constituents, what today gets called its base. But both of them did so, like many social movements, by creating a vast array of leisure time activities to its members and supporters. You could, if you were a Klan family, your whole family could spend all its leisure time in Klan activities. They had a semi-pro baseball team that competed throughout the country, etc. Just as stormtrooper violence against Jews served to confirm Germanness, to cement an identity of superiority, so the Klan used its attacks on immigrants, Catholics, and Jews similarly to confirm the superiority of its members, white Protestants, as true Americans. The Klan was a major force in the first general federal immigration restriction law in the United States, passed in 1924. Some of you may not be familiar with that law, but let me say that it established a set of quotas for each nation and nationality about who was entitled to immigrate into the United States. It had, I'm just going to name a few and hope I remember them correctly. It's something like a 50,000 quota for Germans. It had a 1,000 quota for all of Africa. It was enacting the exact racial hierarchy that the Klan had put out there, and the Klan were extremely influential in the passage of this law. Congressman Albert Johnson of Washington State, who was a Klan enthusiast, was chair of the Committee on Immigration, and he shepherded the bill through Congress. Now, this bill had dire consequences. It remained in effect until 1965. We're talking about 41 years here. And to just cite one example of the cost, while exemptions from quotas were regularly offered to those fleeing Soviet bloc countries, Congress refused to create an exemption to take 20,000 Jewish children fleeing Nazi Germany. Now, Ku Klux Klan cultural values also resembled fascist values, particularly in the drive for what a word that you find in both discourses, and that is purity. For the Nazis, the idea of pure German blood or genetics. For the Klan, the drive toward pure white Protestantism. Behind both, I think, lay an extreme anxiety about diversity. The Klan liked to use the biblical Tower of Babel as a metaphor and believed that a diverse population in the country would make the country inherently unstable. They simply could not imagine an orderly nation state in which groups might have identities beyond the hegemonic patriotic identity. But we also have to remember that this anxiety was created through propaganda and action by the Klan. And let me just mention that the Klan published 150 newspapers around the country, owned 2 radio stations at a time when radio was a new development. They were state-of-the-art in the kind of propaganda they did. Another aspect of the Klan that's redolent of fascism is how the allegedly superior population groups were represented. The Nazis labeled them Aryan, and the Klan labeled them Nordic. And as far as I can tell, they meant exactly the same thing or exactly nothing. Both ideologies rested heavily on these notions of purity. Purity also required women's chastity. The Klan liked to tell very smutty stories about what happened in convents and within the Catholic Church. And in fact, I would say that despite this claim to care about protecting chastity, they engaged in a great deal of sexual titillation in their propaganda. For women in the Klan, this purity was attached to a maternalist vision that honored motherhood as the proper destiny and place of all women. In the Third Reich, as some of you probably know, maternal self-sacrifice replicated the sacrifice needed by the nation and its armed forces. But what's interesting is that in neither group did all the women actually act out these principles of female dependency and submissiveness. In fact, many, both in the Nazi period and in the Klan, and the Women's Klan had 1.5 million members. It was not the same, as large, but it was not small. This is a characteristic that these women actually found themselves enjoying public sphere political activity, precisely what they were saying was not appropriate for women. And this is a contradiction that I think you can find very, very often in conservative politics, that even women who mouth platitudes about motherhood and declare that women belong at home are often unable to resist the satisfactions of political activism. Now, there. Sorry, I meant to show you that. It's just a sense of the intimidatingness of the demonstrations that the Klan would create. But the Klan's form of religious bigotry illuminates the historical specificity of anti-Semitism as well as anti-Catholicism. Now, for the Klan, Catholics, Jews, or Russian or Greek Orthodox believers could never be patriotic Americans because they owed loyalty to foreign powers. Now, for the Catholics and Orthodox, it was the Pope and the Patriarch. For the Jews, who do not have a central rabbi, it was an alleged cabal of bankers that I will refer to. This just illustrates the case against the Catholic Church. Romanism was their word for it, and you see the tentacles that the church was responsible for every evil in the United States. And here's the Pope plotting. Anti-Semitism was, I believe, closer to what we today call racism. Now, that is partly because, as I'm sure many people know, there's a tremendous and actually productive ambiguity about whether Judaism is a religion or an ethnicity. But in this case, for the Klan, a Catholic who converted to Protestantism would be just fine, a good American. By contrast, a Jew could never be acceptable. Jews could not rid themselves of their bodily uncleanness. It was embedded in them. I like to tell one particular story for just a little bit of fun that the Klan liked to promote. You know the story of Jonah and the whale. The whale swallowed Jonah, but he came out whole. Well, in the Klan speak, or Klan writing, he came out whole because Jews are indigestible. Obviously, they may have meant it literally, but it's a perfect metaphor for what they are saying. They can never be integrated into the United States. And furthermore, interestingly enough, the Klan's characterization of the Jews was almost identical to the Nazi version. They were dishonest merchants, avaricious bankers, even as they were also communists. And here you see the crucifixion of Uncle Sam. This is the U.S. in the hands of the Jews. At the far right, you see the classic pejorative image of the Jew, the big nose, etc. Furthermore, the Jews had another problem. This is a slide I kind of hate to show because it is awful, but I wanted to make this point. The Klan complained that the Jews were in cahoots with the blacks in trying to upset the system. It's kind of an interesting statement because it almost as if it's prescient about the civil rights movement, which began a few decades later, in which it is true that Jews were disproportional among the whites who supported civil rights. Both fascists and the Klan foregrounded an ideology of national destiny, unless metaphysical language, we might translate destiny as a national project, a project that's being subverted by dangerous outsiders. For both destiny served to enforce compliance with the movement's demands, but the source of that destiny differed. For the 1920s Klan, it was a God-given destiny. The Klan liked to say, just what this shows, if Jesus were alive today, he would be a Klansman. For the Nazis, the destiny arose from the will of the German people in a kind of what I think of as a circular logic in which the will would lead, the indomitable will of the Germans would lead the master race to destiny, while the superiority of that race was proven by the strength of its will. It also differs because the Nazi version of destiny produced expansionist imperatives. The destiny was to reclaim lands that should belong to the German people, and of course, to cleanse parts of the world that stood in the way of its destiny. But for both, fulfilling the nation's destiny required not only an exaggerated nationalism, but also a rejection of obligations to any institution beyond the nation. The nation should not be constrained by any outside power. For the Klan, this led to isolationism, very particularly great hostility to the League of Nations, as well as to the domestic variant of internationalism, which is, of course, cosmopolitanism. Destiny could make submission to leadership imperative. Lack of that submission would create an obstacle to realizing that destiny by eroding the unity of the family or the folk. In fascist ideology, only a single all-powerful leader could create that unity. The Klan differed on that. The Klan's imperial wizard, by contrast, never assumed such powers. He was constantly squabbling with other kind of fiefdoms among the Klan around the country. And so you do not find that particular aspect of fascism in the Klan. Now, the argument that a nation or a people has a destiny usually deploys tradition as the evidence. Although not all arguments from tradition rest on claims about destiny, all traditionalists seek to restore a glorious past that is being eroded. That tradition is almost always fictitious, as hallowed traditions often are, but the concept of destiny then creates a stronger and more urgent need to respect the imagined tradition. Tradition then becomes timeless and suprahuman. It exists in the realm of the metaphysical. One result is that neither destiny nor tradition can be challenged with evidence. This is where fascism tends toward mysticism, but both movements heavily depended on conspiracy theories, and those theories immunize believers from disproof. The conspiracy allegations are, by definition, impervious to evidence precisely because they are conspiracies which are, of course, secret. And so you find that over and over again. Again, turning to Umberto Eco, whose writings I like a lot, he wrote about this imperviousness to facts, and I quote, "There can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all." Now, not the least successful aspect of the Klan's expression of bigotry was its use of evangelical Protestant ministers. It claimed to have 40,000 ministers, members. I don't believe any of their claims about numbers. They always exaggerated, but it is true that they had many thousands, and they were exempt from paying the very steep initiation fees and dues. Just parenthetically, let me say right there that a lot of people, especially critics, like to think of the Klan as composed of poor or ignorant or rural clodhoppers. Absolutely not true. The initiation fee was $10, which is worth about at least $120 today. So these are not poor people. But clearly, these ministers were extremely important as traveling lecturers of the Klan. They are people who are accustomed to sermonizing and are pretty good at it. We know that the thousands praised the Klan from the pulpit. The Klan liked to demonstrate at churches and to express its alliance with evangelical Protestantism. The ministers, this is a little out of place. This is the Pope doing another thing that the Catholics did wrong, which is subliminally teaching Catholic ideology to children in the public schools. You see, he's got his club, which is violence, but he's really aiming at that public school. The ministers, I think, provide a clue as to what makes conspiracy talk believed. The Klan, let me just give you some examples of what I mean by conspiracy. Here you have you see the Catholic leaders are turned into crocodiles who are threatening people, and the man is trying to protect the children. The Klan contended that all these immigrants coming to the United States did not come because they were poor, did not come because they were persecuted. They came because they were sent by the Pope with instructions to live incognito. Think like moles in an espionage story. They were to be underground until they were given the signal for the coup that was going to turn this into the United Catholic States of America. At a more local level, some of them like to say that the Pope had already arrived in Washington, D.C. in disguise, and he was already building the mansion that would become the capital of the Catholic United States. Now, as to the Jewish conspiracy, the Klan adopted the notorious Russian forgery, the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If any of you don't know what they are, it comes out of Russia. It was a forged document that claimed to be the minutes of a cabal of Jewish financiers, which laid out their plan to take control of the world. Henry Ford was a major purveyor of this. He funded the publication of 500,000 copies of the protocols. He serialized it in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And again, this points to the fact that you have many highly respectable and legitimated people supporting the Klan. Now, of course, both fascists and Klan's people relied on demagogic speakers to mobilize political emotion, notably fear and then anger. The Klan established a large pool of skilled lecturers, many of them the ministers I referred to. I want to remind you that in the 1920s, probably here, but at least in the United States, attending lectures remained a common pastime. In 1920, there were still very few radios. There were very, very few films that were accessible to Klan people. These traveling lecturers drew large audiences and collected admissions fees. The demagoguery, I believe, probably had its maximum effect in the mass rallies that both the Klan and the Nazis put on. No, they are not at all comparable in size. I understand that. But they are using a very dramatic kind of choreography to project, to make themselves desirable, to project the unity of the cause that they represent. And above all, to intensify pride in belonging to the master race. You add to this the Klan's burning crosses, some as high as 50 feet. I don't know if that could be true. I don't believe their figures, but it clearly was an awesome display. And after their rallies and so on, they would have these torchlight parades in which they all paraded with burning torches. Now, some aspects of the Nazi movement don't fit the Klan at all, and one of them is the glorification of violence, even the glorification of sacrificial death on behalf of the folk. In the Third Reich, aggression was accompanied, in the words of historian George Mossy, by an obsession with death, which he called the Totenkult. Still, the Klan was not 100% nonviolent. It worked closely with the police in raids on saloons and bootleggers. Police department frequently deputized Klansmen. Some police departments allowed their own cops to patrol while they were in Klan uniforms. Throughout this period, and I'll say more about what the violence was, it was mainly attacking saloons and bootleggers. It was mainly in defense of prohibition. But not a single Klansman, to the best of my knowledge, was ever convicted of a crime. But the Klan leaders faced a little bit of a problem because they knew that they were really, what they used as their strategy was working. The strategy was propaganda and electoral activity, entirely legal activity, but they also knew that vigilantism was attractive to certain people, particularly young men. And as a result, the leaders did what, at least in the US today, we call dog whistling. While publicly and repeatedly insisting that theirs was an entirely nonviolent group, they found ways to entice young men with pugnacious confrontational rhetoric. Just to give you one example of this vigilante stuff that is not directly violent, there may be people here who have read the Autobiography of Malcolm X. In that autobiography, he talks about how the Klan drove his family out of Nebraska, where they lived at the time, by having riders like those at the top who came there and simply just circled the house over and over again. And you can easily understand that that is a direct threat. Now, the vigilantism is typically an exclusively male activity, but that did not by any means seem to make women uncomfortable with it. Women were enthusiastic Klan members. Let me return to a point I made before about the fact that they would mouth these platitudes about belonging at home. But what happened is, as soon as they began to organize in the Women's Klan, they began in many ways to resist male dominance. They began refusing to send their share of the dues that were supposed to go to the headquarters of the male Klan. Male Klansmen liked to think that they would have the power to appoint who would be the head of a women's Klan unit, and they would completely refuse that. Finally, a quick word about authoritarian leadership and followership. I said that it's obvious in Nazism, but the Klan had its version, which was the arcane occult rituals that were required in chapter meetings, and the choreography, symbols, and fearsome oaths. The Klan was able to benefit both from secrecy and lack of secrecy. Although it was an entirely public organization, advertising in the newspapers, marching without masks frequently, its rituals in the chapter meetings were secret. And members had to swear not to reveal them on pain of dreadful punishments. And this secrecy itself was a draw because it made you feel like a privileged insider to be able to join this. Okay, the degree of overlap between populism and fascism is, of course, open to interpretation. as I said before, I'm not comfortable with thinking that fascism is just extreme populism, but I'm also completely committed to the fact that we have to accept that the definitions of both concepts are fuzzy and are used differently in different occasions. What's more important, I think, is that neither populism nor fascism as a label is adequate to illuminate current dangers. Obviously, history does not repeat itself, and labels, I think, often stand in the way of being specific. They inhibit the close observation and analysis of what is actually happening. My earlier list of populist features is not a checklist from which we can diagnose, categorize, and label various movements. New features always appear, and it is often the particularities of these varied movements that are the most revealing. Furthermore, it is often the interaction of these attitudes and ideologies, their concurrence and their synergy, that can take a movement in a fascist direction. The journalist Dorothy Thompson, some of you may know that she spent years covering Nazi Germany, as well as living through the 1920s heyday of the Klan. She pointed out, and I quote, "No people will ever recognize their dictator in advance. He never stands for election on the platform of dictatorship. He always represents himself as the instrument of the people. When our dictator turns up, you can depend on it that he will be one of the boys and he will stand for everything traditionally American." So, my final sentence is simply that I'm more comfortable with fascistic as an adjective than I am with fascism as a noun. And now I'm going to stop. And
a lot to unpack in that discussion, and you're in a room filled with people who are probably going to have a lot of interesting questions, particularly through the prism of contemporary politics. You're end quote there, prescient, some might say. But I want to talk to you first about your body of research in the book you published, looking at the Klan from the 1920s, the second version of the Klan. In the title of the book, it says, the KKK of 1920s and the American political tradition. And I wondered, that obviously is deliberate, but I wondered if you wanted to explain a little bit about how that got into the title.
I see, it used to be called nativism, this hostility to immigrants, and particularly immigrants of the wrong type. I see this tradition as a tradition that has flowed through the political culture of the United States nonstop from at least 1850. The way I imagine it visually is that sometimes it goes more underground, and sometimes it is above ground and it is shouted. And I think we have to accept that it is part of our political tradition. Let me just say one other thing about that stream. I have talked with people who say, well, the racism is just as bad when people are whispering it to each other. And I certainly don't condone that, but I do think there's a difference, and I do think it matters because I think when you whisper bigoted things, there's at some level a consciousness that maybe this is not cool, that this is not really a good thing, and that when you shout it, it becomes very much more dangerous.
Yeah. There's a lot in your book, a lot in your research that surprises even those who follow these issues. For example, you talked about the role of women in the second coming of the Klan. Some could view that as a progressive approach to inclusion, but what are your thoughts on that? And I'd love to hear more about what your research uncovered.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I wish I knew more about. One of my favorite things is that a New Jersey chapter of the Women's Klan invited Margaret Sanger to come and talk to them about birth control. I wish I knew what that meant. I wish I knew whether they were using birth control. I wish I knew what the size of their families were. But let me point out that in the 20s, Margaret Sanger was a very controversial character. But I also want to warn you, if you go to the web and look this up, you will see a picture of her standing on a kind of podium lecturing to them. That is a phony. That is a picture that was made. If I had the stuff, I could show you, by taking an image of Margaret Sanger from another thing and pasting it onto an image of the Klan. But I met over and over again this contradiction that these women got to like being in the public, and I get a lot of flack for this, but I titled one chapter Klan Feminism because it was there. You had Klan leaders who were advocating equal inheritance rights, equal divorce rights. Perhaps the most important thing that they promoted was maternal custody of children. This may not register its importance right away to use, but just let me explain that in the law of most states, children, the father had the authority over the children in case of a divorce or a separation. What that meant for women was that if you were an abused woman, you just put up with it, because if you left, you ran the risk of losing your children. So maternal custody was a really important thing. Now, I suspect that the people I call Klan feminists were the minority, but they were there, they published things, they were loud, and in no way did it interfere with their bigotry.
Focused approach. We're going to take a few questions in a minute. I'm just glad that screen went up so I didn't have an image of me in front of that Ferris wheel. Some of those images, I think, would keep me off the Supreme Court if they ever were discovered. Finally, I wanted to ask, you touched on it briefly here. Another thing that I found fascinating was the foothold on politics in the second wave. Governors, congressmen. I mean, it was shocking, the numbers, the pure numbers of them. Was that something that surprised you as well? And I'd love to hear more thoughts about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, they were state-of-the-art propagandists. They had a get-out-the-vote machine that worked, you know, like a well-oiled machine. And in the back of the book, the one appendix that I put there is actually a chart that the Klan made in which they list every senator, and on the right, or table, I guess, I don't know what you call it, on the right is their evaluation of how friendly that senator was to the Klan. And this was the tool for the lobbyists. They had a very extensive lobbying
Sounds like the NRA
operation.
today or something like that, right?
Yes.
I mean, similar parallels in terms of who's supporting the issues we care about.
Yeah. Although it's interesting because I don't think I ever came across Klan stuff that's overtly talking about being armed, though they had these vigilante groups.
But it was a very public platform. This is the thing that surprised me, that you had candidates running on a platform of bigotry, essentially, overtly. And I know that today we look across Europe, certainly in the U.S., far-right groups, far-right groups are openly discussing curtailing immigration and all this other. But in those days, in the 1920s, these were candidates that ran on a platform of bigotry.
Yes. The platforms often involved a lot of what today might be called fake news. I mean, some of the things they would say are just outrageous. I remember one thing that said that 90% of all the police in America are Catholics. I mean, this just, you know, they would make up these things out of whole cloth. The favorite piece of legislation that actually had a chance, they thought, was abolishing Catholic schools. I'm sure they would have wanted to abolish Jewish schools, but there weren't that many of them. That was introduced into almost every state in the United States. It only passed in Oregon. And it was then overturned by the Supreme Court, but I do want to point out, lawyers may understand this better than me, but the reason that court overturned it was not that it was discriminatory. The reason they overturned it is because it was what lawyers called a taking. It was the taking of property that belonged to the Catholic Church, and that is, you know, it's defense of private property, in other words. But they also worked locally to try to drive Catholics and Jews out of public office. They conducted economic boycotts against Jewish merchants, but other merchants, but particularly Jewish merchants. In some cases where you had mostly I think these economic boycott was not very effective. And I think partly it was some of these, they tried to boycott, for example, Meyer and Frank in Portland, Oregon. And Meyer and Frank was a network then of department stores that was the biggest west of the Mississippi. And they got nowhere with that. But they also often got nowhere with the smaller shopkeepers. And I think partly it's because, and I think of it as women who are usually the main shoppers, they're accustomed to buying things in a store that they're used to, that they feel comfortable with, and they're not necessarily going to shift from that pattern. So I don't think, there's some cases, I don't think it worked very well. Yeah. But just one final thing, they tried to get Catholic and Jewish teachers fired from the public schools.
Oh boy.
And sometimes succeeded.
I was also surprised at the extent, and maybe I'm naive to this, the extent at which conspiracy theories played such a big role in attracting people to their groups. We obviously see a lot of that today still prevalent in contemporary politics. We have the internet to amplify all that. But in those days, it actually did have an effect, and it was a weaponized version to attract membership.
Well, I had a lot of trouble understanding why people could accept these absolutely bizarre claims, like the Pope building his mansion in Washington. And one argument about why, which I think is familiar to a lot of people, is they just repeated it over and over again. And if you just repeat things enough times. But I actually think this is where you see the huge importance of the ministers. Because I think people are more likely to believe conspiracy allegations when they hear them
from the pulpit,
from someone they respect. And I think the Klan knew that. And furthermore, one of the ways they kind of drew ministers into their network is they like to give contributions to congregations. And, we're talking evangelical Protestants. The Klan did not have much success with what we call the mainline Protestants, like Episcopalians and Lutherans. But a lot of these evangelical churches were small. Some of them were quite poor. Often you had ministers who could not live on that and had outside jobs. And so the Klan would walk in, maybe that's what they were doing in that picture that I showed, walk in and very ostentatiously present $100 or something like that to the congregation. So they were very, very sharp about this. And let me just say one last thing. I get wound up here. To the best of my knowledge, the Klan was the first social movement that hired a professional PR firm. And that was the first thing they did in 1920.
It's fascinating detail. Well, we could go on, but I do want to open the floor up to some questions. We'll try to be brief, and if you can introduce yourself, would be helpful. Why don't we start in the back, the gentleman in the red sweater there.
Ron Goltz, a freelance teacher in Berlin, Brit. You used the term Catholics this evening, and you showed on the screen the Pope or the bishops. But surely, if we're speaking of Catholics in the United States, we're basically speaking, I would imagine, of the Irish. Yes, and I'd like to know whether there was, you only showed illustrations of the Pope, and not the Irish. I mean, how direct did they really target the Irish Americans?
The Klan was very flexible. And there's one thing I've seen is a set of instructions for recruiters. And it said absolutely what any social movement should say. Say the first thing you do is you research that location and you see what are the issues that drive people there. But back to the Irish, one of the examples of this flexibility, in California in the 1920s, the majority of the farm workers were either Mexican people or Mexican Americans. And the Klan actually got into some kind of small alliances with the Irish Catholic Church against the Mexican Catholics. So first of all, we think of the Irish at that time as still having big populations in Boston, in New York, and those are not places where the Klan was really strong. You can probably understand why. But it didn't mean the Klan wasn't strong in big cities. It had a big presence in Detroit, in Indianapolis, in Chicago, and so on. So I think it is possible that they just thought it's just not going to work to go after the Irish. And frankly, I think the reason, they had published plenty of outright racist stuff about African Americans, but the reason that was not their priority was there were still very few African Americans living in the North at the beginning of the 20s, and they realized that they would just not have traction if that was going to be their main focus.
That's interesting as well. Yeah, right here in front. Sorry to keep you running around with the microphone, but...
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Judy Barringer. I live here in Berlin, an American. One of the questions that was posed in the discussion that just began a few moments ago that you posed, you were talking about American political tradition, this term that's in the title, and you talked about a candidate running on the basis of bigotry. And what flashed in my mind was two words, George Wallace. And I remember, so I'm coming to my question, I remember vividly in George Wallace's heyday, the mobilization of the Klan on his behalf, lest we forget and think it's gone. Of course, it still exists now. And seeing photographs at that time of Klan rallies and filled with children wearing these robes as well, and you showed such a picture from the 1920s. And now I come to the question. I wonder if you can talk about the role of children in the Klan in the 20s, their indoctrination, their education. Certainly the Klan, if they had control of newspapers, they could control the public knowledge of adults. But with children, do they have schools? Were they in the curriculum?
Good question. They did not have schools, but they did have a huge variety of children's clubs. And they would say absolutely directly in what they wrote about them that this is how we have to start young to, bring people into right thinking. That was particularly what a lot of women did. A lot of what the women did in the Klan was, as you might expect, kind of the background work for these, at these big events. It was the women who did the logistics, it was the women who provided the food, and they were really in charge of the children. And you have a few pictures of the little kids in their robes, which they were very proud of, no doubt. But I do have to say, I just don't have a lot of evidence for that. I think, though, that, and I'm not sure if someone has written about it, but they certainly should. There have essentially been 4 clans, though they didn't all have that name. And the third Klan was in response to the Civil Rights Movement. But the most important organization was not the Klan itself, it was the White Citizens Councils. And one of the things I would like to know is to what degree are children taking on that ideology? And I just don't know.
You bring up an interesting point about the 4th incarnation, right? The 3rd being during the Civil Rights era. The 4th would be contemporary white supremacy or separatism. What do you see today in the parallels of what you've learned from the 1920s? Clearly, there are some similarities. Some are overt, but some maybe not so. I wondered if there were some that you wanted to point out.
Yeah, I can say a few things, although I'm really not expert at this. The first and most important point is that the Klan itself is just one small group among a variety of white nationalists. So I don't think you should, if you're concerned with the issue, I don't think you should focus on the Klan itself. My understanding of what's going on with the white nationalists is that there are a whole lot of relatively independent groups and not much coordination, let alone actual federation into an organization. And I think of that as both good news and bad news. The good news is they don't have the power and influence that they might have as a large organization. But the bad news is there's no sort of more cautious leader having any control over them. And so you are getting, my impression is, oh, here's another difference. I think that today's white nationalists are disproportionately young. And that was not true of the Klan. And I think it's true that if men are going to be attracted to violence, it's morally young men. And a lot of them are just itching for a fight. And the Imperial Wizard actually tried to suppress a certain amount of violence within the Klan because he really understood that they would get much further with their legal operations.
Here in front, maybe?
Hi, I'm Laura Katzman. I'm a visiting professor at the Free University. And I have two questions for you, Linda. One is about resistance movements, right? Because we know
what?
resistance movements to the Klan in the 20s. I mean, I know the 30s is often thought of as the heyday of the sort of rise or resurgence of the left. But some of that must have started in the 20s also. So clearly there must have been a great deal of resistance as well. So if you can talk about that. And the second is, and I don't even know if this is true, but would you say that when did the Klan kind of go underground? And is that true? I mean, no, it still exists, but it wasn't as public as it was in the 20s, right?
Really
Later.
good question. When we were talking earlier, you said something that was just perfect as a beginning, which is that we wish we could say there was a large social movement of resistance. That is not the case. You had a lot of exactly the elites that the Klan hated, secular intellectuals, highly educated people who wrote things, journalists lambasting the Klan, and they almost always made this one, I think, serious mistake, which is treating them with disdain as stupid, uneducated stuff. And A, it wasn't true, and B, and I must say that about it not being true, recently people have found membership lists of Klan chapters, and some people, not me, a couple other scholars actually were able to read those against the census, and therefore you can see what the occupations are of the people in the Klan. It was overwhelmingly middle class. But in response to that disdainful language, the Klan, it just confirmed the Klan hatred for these urban elites who do not treat us with respect, right? Another kind of small-scale resistance that did happen, there was violence directed against the Klan. The Klan liked to provoke. So, for example, they liked to put posters announcing their meetings on synagogues. And they did a lot at Notre Dame of that sort. And when they actually tried to sort of circle around or picket the Notre Dame, they were driven out by the Notre Dame students. And I suspect they threw rocks. I don't know about. In Youngstown, Ohio, an industrial town, the Klan marched through there, and people not only threw rocks at them, but shot a couple of Klansmen. And they probably backed off. But, you know, I also wish I could say that industrial working class was consistently anti-Klan, and that is not the case because it depended a lot on the racial, religious, ethnic construction. So, for example, the United Mine Workers in one location sided with the Klan when the mine owners started hiring Slavic workers, who they saw as competitive. So, the decline of the Klan, unfortunately, was due entirely or mostly to internal factors. There was a tremendous amount of corruption. The money was enormous, flowing up, and people began to see what the grand goblins and all these names that they were spending it on. we know that people were not paying their dues, because I've seen some minutes in which they're just constantly saying, you know, brother X has got to be made to pay up. I mean, and people began to think that's all we're doing is paying dues. What else is going on? Then there was the hypocrisy about drinking and about sex, probably. And then in 1925, there was a case that was so egregious that it was reported all over the nation, including the New York Times. And I think for a lot of people it was the last straw. It was the Grand Goblin of Indiana this is the only time I know of that a Klan was convicted. He was convicted of kidnapping, raping, literally torturing, and murdering his female assistant. And it was very sensationalized in the press. And I think a lot of people thought, well, maybe we should step back.
Maybe all the way in the back there?
Hello, I'm Jacob. I study at the Humboldt University. And I have a question. Was the movie The Birth of the Nation as relevant to the formation of the second Klan as is often stated, or was it a correlating event, this movie?
A base for what?
The Birth of the Nation.
He's talking about the film, The Birth of a Nation.
The Birth of a Nation.
Its influence on the
Yeah.
second, the 1920s version of the Klan.
Yeah. That film was like gold for the Klan. It was produced in 1915, before the Klan. Can I assume that most people know what that film was?
So, yeah.
Just an unbelievably awful film. But the Klan used it. They showed it over and over and over again, and they charged money for it, so they got money, but they also loved the film. And it's a very powerful, emotionally powerful film. And furthermore, there were still a lot of people who hadn't seen films. And so it was really a thrill to go and see it. It was absolutely tremendously valuable to them, though they did not originate it. Actually, the influences on the creation of the film came from the Southern Klan, the original Klan.
Right. Well, that's another surprising part of your book. You look at the northern parts of America, but the Klan that you profile, heavy in the North, the Midwest, even the West, progressive states like Oregon, Washington. Was that surprising to you that it could be so lively and millions of followers in those parts of the country?
Well, I guess I shouldn't have been this naive, and I'm not that naive even anymore, but the oddity is the Klan was really strong in its attacks on Catholics and Jews in places where there weren't hardly any. And in a way, maybe that makes it easier, because no one knows a next-door person who's a Catholic and thinks they're okay. But I also think it is a clue to something that's very important, that I don't understand it, but I see it, which is the possibility to rev up and create real hysterias around stuff that isn't at all real. The Klan used some of the same kind of arguments that you hear today, like immigrants are taking all our jobs. That's completely not true. First of all, the labor market is very segregated. Secondly, this was still a period in which there was a tremendous demand for labor. This is not the 30s where you have a decline in production, and so it was a very important thing for me to understand that was the case. But it wasn't always the case. For example, the Klan wasn't strong in New York City, but it was strong in New Jersey, right across the river, and various places in New Jersey. I don't know why that is. But I also think, just as someone who studies social movements, that a lot has to do with whether the recruiter who starts the Klan in a place is a particularly talented guy. Some of them are more charismatic than others, and could really draw people in.
Yeah, sure, right there.
Do you know specifically where, when, who, and how the Klan was founded in the very beginning?
No, I don't. I think you could find that in many you're talking about the Southern Klan right after the Civil War. No, I can't really answer that, but I don't think it would be hard to find that out. Yeah.
Any other questions? You want to go up front here? I think we're trying to spread it around a little bit. Here? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned the influence of the members of the Senate and the House. Could you tell us a little bit more if there were examples where the legislative decision-making process or bills were initiated by members of the House or the Senate, which were based on the influence of the Klan?
There are a couple of places where you see it, and I mentioned that in the Immigration Act, Albert Johnson was the leader of that. But that law of 1924 passed with just very few negative votes. And that leads to another thing. I don't have the evidence for this, but I think it is entirely possible that the majority of white Protestants at that time agreed with the Klan's ideas. They might think the Klan was a little too virulent, was a little too going far, but this was not an alien ideology. All the nasty stories about Jews and Catholics you could find back in the 19th century. And another example of that has to do with eugenics. The Klan, of course, loved eugenics, and I might point out, there's a lot of literature that shows that the Klan was influential in for the Nazi Party. Probably a lot of people know that. They praised the Klan a lot. But one result of the eugenics fad, and in the middle of the 1920s, there would be a eugenics chapter in every biology textbook. That was considered state-of-the-art science. But it produced in at least 30 states these laws about forcibly sterilizing the, quote, feeble-minded. And I probably don't need to say that how they would determine who was feeble-minded, because they're mainly talking about poor and uneducated people and nothing to do with that. But the point is that the Klan fit entirely into that. I can't delineate how much of it was Klan influence, but it was dominant. The one very, very vivid place you see it was in the Democratic Convention of 1924 that was held in in Madison Square Garden in New York City. And the leading candidate going in was Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, but he was a Catholic. And the Klan, in fact, there's a book written about it. The whole convention is known as the Klan Bake. The Klan was able, it took 103 ballots to defeat Al Smith as the candidate. And everyone there said it is the Klan that is doing this organizing. And that's one place where you very vividly see it because you have so many Klan members in one place.
Oh, any other questions from anyone? Have we got someone in the back there? Doing on time? Or?
Hi, my name is Andy. I'm living in Berlin. I'm from Iowa originally. I just wanted to ask about, from the funding perspective of the Klan, you talked in the document, it said 3 to 6 million members, and I think the union dues or the dues were about $10 per person. I'm curious to see, was the funding driven by those monthly or annual dues, or were there big donors driving that funding?
No.
Did the Depression have an impact in 29? And I'm just curious, what kind of insight did we have in their finances,
Right.
which brought them down?
Very, very interesting question, and one of the things I couldn't get to in the talk. This may surprise you. The second Klan was a for-profit corporation incorporated in Atlanta. And they were expert at soaking their members. There was the initiation fee. There were the dues. You had to buy this uniform, and I think, I can't prove this, that the uniform, the robe, was very cleverly designed that an ordinary housewife with a sewing machine couldn't take a sheet and make it. It had to be just so. And they sold them, and I have the figures on this, they sold them with a 300% profit on each one. They got them manufactured. Then they, like the Masons, they had this thing about degrees. You could move up to first degree, second degree, but every time you moved up to a higher degree, you had to pay more. And I don't know much about the Masons, but in the Klan, I could not figure out that this meant anything other than an honorific. The money was just flowing, and you actually have records of Klan people, Klan members saying, I can remember one verbatim I saw, it seems like all this organization does is raise money. What do they do? And about the millions of members, I think we should keep in mind that they may not have had that many all at the same time. I think there was a big turnover because I think people got bored. Nothing was, it wasn't. But one of the things that did hold people in was the stuff that went on in the chapters, which is just fascinatingly interesting. This kind of, it's almost like a medieval rites or something. And I think at first I thought, why would anybody do this? And then I thought, well, this is a kind of participatory theater in which people are going through these rigmaroles. And it's interesting for a while, but it isn't going to hold your interest for long if nothing else is happening. But the hypocrisy about money certainly did a lot to weaken the Klan. And by the late 20s, it was just a complete shadow of itself. But it doesn't mean that their ideas changed. Quite a number of Klans people went into the Nazi groups in the 1930s, which were small, but I think they're more important in the U.S. than people know or talk about.
One more. We've got time for one more, maybe all the way in the back there with the hand raised.
Good evening. Where in America did you grow up, and did you experience racism there? Where you would say, irrespective of the Klan or no Klan?
I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I wasn't born there, but I was born in Chicago and spent some time in other places, but I spent a lot of time there. Portland had a very small black population, and it was, and still is largely, very geographically segregated, and I am ashamed to say that I had no thought about this when I was growing up there. It just did not cross my mind. The other, and this has to do with what I said I really couldn't talk about what counts as a white person. The people who were the other in my high school were Italians, and they were called greasers. I don't know if people have heard that term. And this was a class thing because they were definitely, it was a predominantly middle-class high school, but you would have this group of people who clearly were not in the middle class. The thing about Oregon that's tricky even today is Portland has a reputation for being very liberal, but it's still a very segregated city. And in Eastern Oregon, it's been the home of a lot of right-wing groups, posses, and things like that. So it's wrong to conceive of even today's Oregon. But just one more thing. I wish that someone would write a book about how Portland went from being, Exhibit A for the Klan to having its reputation today as very liberal and hippie. I think it would be a great topic for a book, but I'm not going to write it.
I think that's all we have.
Yeah.
Linda, thank you so much for coming out and talking to us. And thank you so much. Thank you.